Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. And let us know in the comments where you're joining from and what time it is for you. This tells the algorithm you want more stories like this one. She was never meant to be a bride. She was hardly more than a child. The year was 1911, in the remote mist-shrouded hills of Appalachia, where the mountains stood like silent sentinels, and the reach of the law was a distant rumor. Claraara Witford had been pledged her future bartered, before she could even form her first words. By her 9th birthday, her destiny was sealed, not to a stranger, but to a cousin more than twice her years. And in that isolated valley, this wasn't considered an outrage. It was simply the way things had always been. The few surviving photographs are chilling. A girl with sunken cheeks from a poor diet, a faded ribbon in her hair that had been handed down through generations. Her dress wasn't a bridal white, but a discolored antique garment pulled from a forgotten chest. And standing beside her, a man whose face was carved with lines, not just from time, but from a deep, ancestral craving that had been satisfied the same way for generations. The intermarrying in these communities wasn't a secret. It was etched into the very DNA of the families. Bloodlines coiled back on themselves so many times that the family tree was less of a tree and more of a tangled knot. In Claraara's case, her own parents were already closely related. This wedding wasn't just the joining of two people. It was the perpetuation of a sealed cycle, a cycle that had already yielded children who struggled to walk, whose speech was slurred, whose entire world was confined to a few square miles. The local minister called it divine providence. The family called it preserving their lineage. Outsiders seldom traveled the muddy track that led to her father's home, and when they did, they knew better than to pry. In these parts, curiosity had a way of making people vanish, and so Claraara became a wife before she knew her multiplication tables. She cooked his meals. She scrubbed his clothes in the icy stream, and she learned, far too early, that the bedroom door was not a boundary she was permitted to set. This was her existence, until the day something occurred that would set the entire community murmuring. Claraara's universe was bounded by the steep walls of the hollow. The people within it were governed by an unspoken code, one that elevated family above everything. Even when the concept of family had become distorted, her husband, Elijah Whitford, was not just her cousin, but a man who had spent his youth under the same roof as her mother. In truth, his ownership of her began long before she could comprehend what that meant. Elijah was 32 when he married Claraara. To him, she was an asset, not an equal. His kin had spent lifetimes trading daughters between relatives to keep property and surnames from falling into outside hands. Periodically, the Whitfords would hold a gathering, a sort of arranged market, where young girls were matched with pre-selected men. It was at one of these events, when Claraara was still a toddler, that her future was settled with a handshake between men whose blood was already too intertwined. The Whitford lineage was infamous, even in neighboring communities. Their eyes, people murmured, had a vacant stare, and some of their children were born with peculiar malformations, webbed fingers, misaligned jaws, minds that never fully developed. But instead of a mark of shame, these traits became a twisted symbol of authenticity. To be a true Whitford was to carry the evidence in your very flesh. Claraara was unaware of all this as a little girl. All she knew was that Elijah was a constant figure. He would give her small whittled toys, show her how to fetch water from the well, and scold her if she forgot to address him properly. By 8, he had already taken up residence in her family's cabin, claiming it was to prepare for their life together. By 9, the preacher was summoned, and a heavy Bible was placed in her small, unsteady hands. There was no romance, no way out, and absolutely no choice. The women in her family told her it was her obligation. They said it with strained smiles and voices that only wavered when the men were out of hearing. And though Claraara lacked the vocabulary for it, a cold fear began to crystallize inside her. one that would cling to her for the rest of her days. It was this fear that sharpened her senses to things others ignored. There were elements of Elijah's history that were strictly off-limit, murmurs about a previous wife, whispers about her fate. And the more Clara May listened, the more she understood that this marriage had been ordained by blood long before her birth. Clara May first learned of Elijah's first wife on a winter's night, when the wind moaned through the cracks in the cabin walls. Her grandmother was darning a sock, her fingers flying, when she said it almost to herself. "You're his second." The words were nearly lost to the fire's crackle, but Clara May heard them. Second. No one had mentioned a first. When she asked who she was, the old woman's gaze shot to the door, then back to her work. "Some questions are best left unasked." That was all she would say. But in the quiet of the mountains, a forbidden question doesn't disappear. It festers. Over the following months, she collected whispers. The first wife had also been a Witford, from the other side of the ridge. Some said she was frail. Others implied she was made frail. Then, one fall, she was just gone. There was no service. No grave was ever tended. Those living near Elijah's land muttered that she had fled into the wilderness. Others, in tones barely audible, suggested she never left, that she rested somewhere behind the barn, in earth so rocky and bitter that nothing would ever take root there. The most unsettling part was Elijah's behavior afterward. He never mourned. He never spoke of her. It was as if she had been erased, and yet he claimed Clara May shortly after, with a haste that felt unsettling, as if replacing a lost bride was a mere matter of logistics. In Witford Hollow, no one contradicted Elijah. He was a quiet man, but his silence carried a threat that kept people in line. Some believed the land was his by right, that he held the power of banishment. The fact that he chose Clara May, a child of 9, was never publicly questioned. But to Clara May, it began to feel like a life sentence, passed down before she was old enough to understand the crime. In the quiet of their home, Elijah would sometimes watch her with a look that made her blood run cold, calculating, assessing stare, as if she were an animal he'd acquired young and was waiting to mature. In those moments, she started to dread that the fate of the first wife might one day become her own. The spring after her wedding, Clara May began to perceive the hollow differently. She noticed details she'd previously missed, things the adults either ignored or willfully overlooked. Elijah's property was set apart from the rest, its barn sagging with age, the wood bleached to a silvery gray. Behind it, the land dipped toward a section where the grass grew sparse and sickly, as if fighting something beneath the surface. Clara May had heard the tales about that spot, but she didn't need them to feel its truth. Elijah kept her on a short leash, rarely permitting her beyond the property's edge. On the rare occasions she wandered, she would encounter other Witford women, their expressions weary and resigned, hanging, washing, or hauling water. They would look at her, but their faces remained solemn. A profound weight rested in their eyes, a shared understanding that aged them prematurely. Clara May started to realize they were all ensnared in the same web, born into it, bound by it, with no hope of flight. On Sundays, Elijah took her to the small wooden church. The preacher would sermonize about submission, a wife's responsibility to her husband, and maintaining the purity of the bloodline. Clara May observed that in this church, there were no true outsiders. Every face was a reflection of another, every family linked to the next by kinship. The children shared similar features, the men resembled one another. It was a hall of mirrors, and in that relentless sameness, Clara May began to feel she was drowning. One day, while collecting eggs, the older woman, Hester, approached her silently. She leaned close, her voice a hushed breath. "You be careful around him, child." Clara May froze. "Why?" Hester's eyes flicked toward the barn. "Because you look like the first one did." And with that, she was gone, leaving Clara May alone with her basket and a racing heart. From that moment, Clara May couldn't stop thinking about the first wife. She pictured her walking the same paths, her hands performing the same chores, her eyes meeting the same grim looks from Elijah. And she pictured, too, the moment she disappeared, whether into the forest or into the ground. The hollow had its laws, and Clara May was learning that the most perilous one was this: when a Witford wife vanishes, you never wonder what happened to her. By midsummer, the burden of her marriage was becoming unbearable. The cabin was small, yet Elijah's dominance saturated every inch of it. He moved silently, his unblinking eyes always on her. At night, the silence was more terrifying than any sound. The groan of the floorboards under his feet became a dreadful language, signaling his approach, his arrival at her room, the opening of her door. Her body was still that of a child's, but in Elijah's world, she was his wife, in every sense of the word. There was no concept of consent. The Witford women were taught that their husband's word was final, and Clara May was no exception, but a secret part of her still rebelled. She hid her resistance in tiny acts of defiance, staking her time with chores, escaping to the creek to feel the cold water on her skin, lingering at the edge of the property to watch the road. One evening, a summer storm blew in fiercely, turning the road to mud. As the wind howled, Elijah stood at the window, staring into the trees. Clara May followed his gaze and thought she saw a shadow flit between the trunks. When she asked who it was, Elijah didn't answer. He only grumbled, "Shouldn't be nobody out there." His voice was even, but it held an edge that made her shudder. Later, after the storm had passed and Elijah was asleep, Clara May crept to the window. The air was heavy with the scent of rain and damp soil. And there, just beyond the barn, she saw it, a faint, bobbing lantern light moving toward that barren patch of ground. She couldn't see who held it, but the sight made her chest constrict. In the days that followed, the whispers grew louder, talk of midnight digging, of bones discovered years ago on the property, of other women who had disappeared from Witford Hollow. And for the first time, Clara May wondered if she wasn't just a bride, but the next entry on a long hidden list. If you're still watching, you have a strong stomach. Tell us in the comments, what would you do if this was your legacy? The summer heat was oppressive, but for Clara May, a deeper chill had set in. She had started to recognize patterns in Elijah's behavior, routines he followed meticulously. Some were benign, like cleaning his knife each night. Others were more sinister. Every month, on the darkest night, he would leave the cabin after supper and not return until sunrise. He never offered an explanation. If she dared to ask, his face would harden and he'd snap, "Don't concern yourself with my affairs." But Clara May noticed these absences always followed days when he was especially irritable, pacing the rooms like a caged animal. On one of those nights, she waited until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then, she slipped out of bed and crept into the darkness. The moon was a mere sliver. She followed the crunch of his boots, just enough to see him enter the barn. Peering through a crack, she saw him light a lantern and set it down. He bent, and in his hands was a shovel. The blade bit into the earth with a soft, grating sound. Clara May's blood ran cold. She didn't know if he was burying or unearthing. She retreated silently, terrified her own pulse would betray her, and slipped back into the cabin. She didn't sleep a wink. In her mind's eye, she saw that barren patch behind the barn. By morning, Elijah was back, sipping his coffee as if it were any other day. But Clara May saw the soil lodged under his nails. She smelled the dank odor of disturbed earth on his boots. And she knew whatever the Witford men had hidden there was meant to stay hidden forever. The realization settled deep within her, and for the first time, she began to seriously consider the unthinkable: escape. Clara May started to test her confines. It began with small acts, delaying her return from the creek, pretending not to hear Elijah's calls, venturing past the boundary trees. She knew the punishment for overstepping would be severe, but the idea of freedom had taken root in her mind. Stubborn and tenacious, she began to study the road with renewed intensity. Strangers were rare, but occasionally a trader or a county official would pass through. Clara May imagined throwing herself in their path, explaining her nightmare, but she didn't have the words. How do you describe a prison built by your own ancestors? How do you explain a fate decided before you could talk? One afternoon, while drawing water from the well, she saw Hester again. This time, the woman's face was pale with fear, her eyes constantly scanning for observers. She pressed a crumpled note into Clara May's palm. Don't read it here. Hide it. And for God's sake, don't let him find it. Clara May tucked it into her dress and finished her work, her heart hammering against her ribs. That night, by the dim light of a lamp, she smoothed out the paper. The writing was frantic, scrawled. He put her in the ground, where nothing grows. You are not safe. Don't wait for winter. It was unsigned, but Clara May needed no signature. The message was clear. It wasn't just the first wife. There had been others. The next morning, Elijah's watchfulness intensified. Perhaps he had seen the exchange. Perhaps he simply sensed the shift in her demeanor, the new tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes now constantly strayed toward the road. The hollow was a place where secrets eventually surfaced. For Clara May, the question was no longer if she would uncover the truth, but if she would live long enough to tell it. The first frost arrived unexpectedly, painting the high ridges in white, while the hollows remained shrouded in damp cold. For Clara May, the changing season felt like a final countdown. Every warning, every shadow, every glance toward the barn now carried a terrifying weight. She knew a Whitford winter was a long, desolate prison, and whatever Elijah intended for her would happen before the snows sealed them in. On a bleak afternoon, Elijah informed her they would be taking a walk after supper. His tone left no room for debate. She tried to keep her hands steady as she served him, every spoonful feeling like a step toward an abyss. When darkness fell, he lit a lantern and commanded her to follow. They walked past the barn, past the fence line, straight to that barren, cursed patch of earth. The ground was stiff with cold, the dead grass crunching under her worn shoes. Elijah halted, setting the lantern on a stump. He stared at her for a long, silent moment. You're a Whitford wife, he said, his voice unnervingly calm, and Whitford wives know their place. He didn't advance. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out the folding knife she'd seen him hone countless times. In the lantern's jumpy light, the steel gleamed. Sharp and cruel against the deepening night dot, Clara May's every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet were frozen to the spot. She thought of Hester's warning, of the note, of the first wife, and the other forgotten women. She thought of the mysterious lantern she'd seen months before, and she knew this was their final chapter. But just as Elijah shifted his weight, a new sound fractured the silence, the crunch of heavy, deliberate footsteps coming down the slope. Elijah turned, and Clara May saw shapes materializing from the gloom. 3 men, 2 with rifles, 1 holding a shovel. She knew them. Whitford's. Elijah's face tightened in anger. Told you to stay out of this? He muttered, not to her, but to the approaching men. No one spoke another word. The men simply stood there, the shovel glinting, the cold pressing in from all sides. And in that frozen, heart-stopping instant, Clara May understood something even more horrifying than she had imagined. These men hadn't come to rescue her. They had come to assist him. And that was the last anyone in the hollow ever said about Clara May Whitford. The silence that followed was thicker than the mountain fog, more final than a slammed door. The 3 men, Jeb, Caleb, and Old Man Whitford, formed a half-circle behind Elijah, their faces carved from the same grim stone as the hills. The shovel in Jeb's hands wasn't a tool, it was a promise. Elijah didn't look at Clara May again. His gaze was fixed on the patch of earth at their feet, "It's time," he said, and his voice was not his own. It was the voice of the hollow itself, ancient, unforgiving, and weary. Jeb stepped forward and drove the shovel's blade into the hard ground. The sound was a dull thud that seemed to suck all other noise from the world. Caleb and Old Man Whitford stood guard, their rifles not quite aimed, but held in a way that made their purpose clear. This was a ritual. They had done it before. Clara May's paralysis broke. The primal urge for survival screamed louder than her fear. She turned to run, a desperate, soundless cry caught in her throat, but Caleb was on her in 2 long strides. His hand, rough and calloused, clamped over her mouth, and his other arm wrapped around her middle, lifting her from the ground as if she were a sack of grain. She kicked and thrashed, but he was immovable. Elijah watched, his expression unreadable, as Jeb dug. The hole didn't need to be deep, just deep enough. "It's a pity," Old Man Whitford said, his voice a dry rasp. "She was a good worker." "Quiet," Elijah snapped. "This is the way it's done. The blood gets too thin, the mind gets too sharp. They start asking questions. They start seeing things they shouldn't." Clara May's eyes, wide with terror, met Elijah's over Caleb's arm. She saw no malice there, only a cold, procedural certainty. To him, this was not murder. It was pruning. It was maintaining the purity of the closed loop, weeding out the ones who threatened to see beyond the mountains. Jeb stopped digging, the hole a dark mouth at their feet. "It's ready." Elijah nodded and finally approached Clara May. He didn't brandish the knife like a weapon. He held it like a surgeon's tool. "The first one fought too," he murmured, almost to himself. "It's always the ones who look like her who fight." He reached out, not to stab, but to cut a strand of her hair. He wrapped it around his finger, a keepsake. Then he looked at Caleb. "Do it." Caleb began to lower her into the hole. The cold, damp soil pressed against her back. She stared up at the sliver of moon, a silent witness in a sky that had seen this too many times. The world narrowed to the circle of their faces, backlit by the single lantern, and the smell of wet clay and decay. But as her feet touched the bottom, a sound echoed through the hollow. It wasn't an animal. It was the distinct, sharp crack of a branch snapping under a heavy boot, too close for comfort. All 4 men froze, their heads whipping toward the tree line. The spell was broken. "Who's there?" Jeb barked, hefting his shovel like a weapon. From the shadows, a figure emerged. It was Hester, but she was not alone. Behind her, standing with a posture of authority that was utterly foreign to the hollow, was the county surveyor, a man named Proudfoot, who had been mapping the ridges for the new railway. He held a rifle of his own, and his eyes widened in horror as he took in the scene, the half-dug grave, the men with their weapons, the child being lowered into the earth. "Hester." "You fool woman," Elijah hissed. "I couldn't let it happen again." "Elijah," Hester said, her voice trembling but clear. "Not again. Not after my Sarah." The surveyor, Proudfoot, leveled his rifle. "I suggest you men step away from that girl, now." His voice carried the weight of a world beyond the mountains. A world with different laws. For a moment, it hung in the balance. 4 Whitford men against 1 outsider. The old code versus the new. But the sight of that official rifle, and the knowledge that an outsider had now seen, introduced a variable their closed system couldn't process. The ancient hunger in Elijah's eyes warred with a new, unfamiliar emotion, fear. Caleb released Clara May so quickly she fell back into the shallow grave, scraping her hands on the stones. He and Jeb took a step back, their defiance crumbling. Old Man Whitford just stared at the ground, defeated. Elijah's gaze fell on Clara May, still crumpled in the dirt. The certainty was gone from his face, replaced by a look of pure, bewildered loss. The loop had been broken. Proudfoot didn't wait. He strode forward, keeping his rifle trained on the men, and reached into the hole. He pulled Clara May out, wrapping his coat around her shivering shoulders. She clung to him, her small hands fisting in the rough wool, her face buried against the strange, clean scent of tobacco and soap, as Proudfoot led her away. Down the path that led out of the hollow, Clara May dared one last look back. The 4 Witford men stood frozen around the open earth, the lantern casting their long, distorted shadows against the barn. They looked like ghosts already, trapped in a ritual that had finally been interrupted. She didn't know what would happen to her, or to them, but as she walked away from the thin mountain air and the long shadows, she knew one thing for certain. She was the first Witford wife to ever leave the hollow alive, and her silence was the one thing they would never own again. The path out of the hollow was a blur of terror and disbelief. Clara May's small, cold hand was swallowed by the surveyor's firm grip as he had fled, half carried her through the darkness. The sounds of the night, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of unseen creatures were no longer the familiar whispers of home, but the noises of a world she had been taught to fear. Behind them, a single, guttural shout echoed, followed by a sharp, silencing crack. Proudfoot flinched but did not look back, his pace quickening. Clara May knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that Hester had paid the price for her courage. "Don't look, child," Proudfoot murmured, his voice tight. "Just keep walking. We have to get to my wagon." They broke from the tree line into a small clearing where a horse and wagon stood tethered. Proudfoot lifted her onto the seat, as if she weighed nothing, then climbed up beside her, snapping the reins. The horse jolted into a trot, then a canter, the wagon rattling violently down the rocky path. Clara May clutched the seat, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the disappearing outline of the mountains that had been her entire world. They rode in silence for what felt like an eternity, until the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. Proudfoot finally slowed the horse on a proper dirt road, the first Clara May had ever seen. "Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse and fear. "To Franklin," he said, his kind eyes filled with a pity that made her want to shrink away. "The county seat. There are people there, good people. They'll know what to do." Franklin was a shock. The clatter of carts, the sheer number of people, the 2-story buildings, it was an assault on her senses. Proudfoot took her directly to the sheriff's office. The sheriff, a large man with a thick mustache, listened to Proudfoot's story with growing horror. He looked at Clara May, at her threadbare dress and hollow eyes, and his face softened. "You're safe now, little lady," he said, his voice gentle. "You're with the law." But the law, Clara May would soon learn, moved slowly and was tangled in roots that reached all the way back to the hollow. A week later, Deputy Sheriff Miller returned from Witford Hollow. His report was grim. "It's their word against a child's, Sheriff," Miller said, shaking his head. He refused to look at Clara May, who sat on a hard bench in the corner. "Elijah Whitford and his kin swore up and down that the girl is prone to hysterical fits, that she ran off into the woods after a beating for disobedience. They said, Proudfoot here stumbled upon her and got the wrong idea. They said there's no grave. They'd filled it in by the time we got up there. As for Hester, they said she was just like the first wife. She walked into the woods and never came back. They said this is very common in that family." Proudfoot slammed his hand on the desk. "And you believe that? You saw the girl's state." "I believe what I can prove in a court of law," the sheriff said heavily. "Without a body, without a witness besides a 9-year-old girl from a family known for infirmities, there's nothing I can do. The Whitfords stick together. It's a closed world up there." Clara May was placed in the county orphanage. It was a clean, stark place with rules she didn't understand, and girls who stared at her strange accent and fearful demeanor. She was safe, fed, and clothed, but the hollow had left its mark deeper than any physical wound. She jumped at loud noises, flinched from men's touches, and woke screaming from nightmares of falling into cold. Dark earth. The world had saved her body, but her spirit remained in that barren patch of ground. Then, one rainy afternoon, a visitor came. It was a woman named Eleanor Vance, who ran a small printing press with her husband. She had heard the whispers about the wild child from the hills, and was writing a piece on the orphanage. Eleanor didn't look at Clara May with pity. She looked at her with intensity. She sat with her for hours, not asking questions, just talking softly. On her third visit, she brought a slate and a piece of chalk. "Can you read, Clara May?" Clara May shook her head. "Would you like to learn?" It was the first choice anyone had ever given her that didn't involve obedience or death. Slowly, she nodded. Learning to read and write was like breaking a second set of chains. The squiggles on the page transformed into words, and the words gave shape to the terror inside her. One afternoon, a year after she had arrived, Clara May, now 10, picked up a piece of paper and a pencil. Her hand trembled, but her will was iron. She didn't write a story. She wrote a list. Elijah Whitford. First wife. Name unknown. Gone. Hester Whitford. Gone. The patch behind the barn, the shovel, the lantern, the men with rifles. The whole. She showed it to Eleanor. The woman's face paled, but her eyes burned with a fierce light. "Is this what happened to you?" Clara May nodded, her throat too tight for words. "This is your testimony, Clara May," Eleanor said, gripping her hands. "Your truth, and the world needs to hear it." Eleanor and her husband began a quiet investigation. They tracked down old county records, spoke to peddlers who traveled the remote routes, and even found an elderly midwife who had been run out of Whitford Hollow decades before for speaking too freely. The story they pieced together was a tapestry of silence and suffering, of women who vanished and were never spoken of again, all to maintain the purity of a dying bloodline. Eleanor published the story. It wasn't in a big city paper, but the Franklin Gazette had a reach that stretched further than the Whitfords could have imagined. It was picked up by a newspaper in Knoxville, and then another in Nashville. The story of the child bride in the haunted hollow became a national scandal. This time, when the law returned to Whitford Hollow, it was not a single deputy. It was the sheriff, 6 armed men, and a state attorney. They went straight to the patch behind Elijah's barn and, ignoring his furious protests, started to dig. They found what Clara May knew they would. Not one body, but 3. The first, a woman in a rotting yellow dress. The second, Hester, a faded ribbon still in her hair. The third, so old only bones remained. Elijah, Jeb, and Caleb Whitford were arrested for murder. The trial was swift. Clara May did not have to testify. The evidence in the ground was testimony enough. They were sentenced to hang on the day of the execution. Clara May stood at the window of Eleanor's home. She had been taken in by the childless couple and looked toward the mountains. She felt no triumph, only a profound, echoing quiet. The ancient hunger of the hollow had finally been starved. Years later, a grown Clara May Vance had proudly taken her adoptive parents' names stood before a small, fresh headstone in a peaceful Franklin cemetery. She had paid to have the remains of the first wife and Hester properly laid to rest. The headstone was simple, for the Whitford women, silent no more. She placed a single wildflower on the grass. The mountains in the distance no longer looked like walls. They were just mountains. The loop was broken. Her own children, playing safely in the sun-dappled yard behind her, would never know the long shadows of the hollow, or the price their mother had paid to bring them into the light. Her story had ended not in a grave, but with a word, written on a page. That had echoed louder than any shovel against stone. The sun warmed the back of Clara May's neck as she straightened up from the headstone. The past was a quiet, settled weight inside her now, not a screaming ghost. The sound of her children's laughter, chasing a butterfly, and little Eleanor, Carefully arranging dandelions in a pile was a melody that had permanently drowned out the echoes of the hollow. But the past, while settled, was not forgotten. It had become her purpose. She walked back to the house, a neat 2-story home filled with books and light, so different from the dark cabin of her childhood. Her husband, David, a quiet, kind man who taught history at the local school, looked up from his papers and smiled. "All right?" he asked, his voice a gentle anchor. "All right," she said, and she meant it. On her desk, next to a stack of her children's drawings, lay the manuscript. The working title was simple, stark: The Unmarked Grave. It was not just her story. It was Hester's story. It was the story of the first wife, whose name she had painstakingly uncovered from old family records as Mary Louise. It was the story of all the women whose voices had been swallowed by the mountains. Eleanor, now gray-haired, but with eyes as sharp as ever, had helped her structure it. "You're not just telling a horror story, Clara," she'd said. "You're writing a history that they tried to bury. You're giving them a headstone in print." The book was published later that year. The Knoxville Sentinel called it a devastating and necessary portrait of a hidden America. It was more than a local sensation. It became a foundational text for social reformers and early women's rights advocates, a stark illustration of what could happen when women were treated as property. One afternoon, a letter arrived. The handwriting was spidery and unfamiliar, the postmark from a distant county. "Mrs. Vance, I read your book. My name is Annette, and I was born a Coulter from Black Rock Holler. Your story is my story. We was all promised to uncles or cousins, and my sister, she disappeared when I was 12. We was told she run off. After reading your words, I know she did not run. You gave me the courage to leave. I am working in a mill now. It is hard, but I am free. Thank you for your voice." It called out to mine. Clara May held the letter, her hands trembling not with fear, but with a powerful, humbling conviction. She was not just a survivor. She was a beacon. This was the true end of the loop. It wasn't just the hanging of Elijah Whitford. It was this: a letter from a stranger, a life changed, a story shared that broke a chain of silence in another hollow, miles away. Years turned. Thomas became a lawyer, advocating for women's legal rights. Eleanor, named for her fierce grandmother, became a teacher, ensuring the children in her classroom could all read and write, that they knew they had choices. On Clara May's 50th birthday, surrounded by her family, her grandchildren playing at her feet, she felt a peace so profound it was like a physical warmth. The girl with the hollow cheeks and the yellowing dress was a faded photograph in a book now. The woman she had become had built a life, a family, a legacy of defiance and love. That night, as she looked out her window at the stars, clear and bright, away from the mountain mists, she thought of the Whitford name. It had died with Elijah in that prison yard, extinguished by the very hunger it sought to feed. Her name was Vance. It meant to conquer, and she had conquered the shadows, the silence, and the grave. Her story, once meant to be buried in a barren patch of earth, was now sown in the minds of thousands, a seed that grew into forests of courage. The long hunger of the hollow was finally, and forever, full.